Welcome to Gilbert, Arizona. This is the Church Without Walls, and I'm John Kirkwood, and this is...
Peyton.
We were on a walk the other day, and Peyton came up with a great idea. She said, I think to alleviate her boredom, she said, why don't every time we take the family walk, we ask a big question? And she said, then we could talk, we could all answer the question and talk about it. And so we risked it. And she said, Dad, you come up with the first question. So off the cuff, being a lover of history, I said, okay, if you could go back to one moment in world history, and I separated out Jesus in the Bible because otherwise people would be compelled to pick a Jesus moment. But I said, if you could pick one moment in world history that you could go back to, what would it be? And I made the mistake of going first, and I said, I think for me, I'd want to go back to the gunfight at the OK Corral. And then after having seen that, I'd like to have a whiskey with Doc Holliday, because next to Jesus, Doc Holliday for me. I don't know about you. And my wife came up with, of course, to virtue signal and outdo her husband. My wife said she'd like to stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and to hear the "I Have a Dream" speech by Martin Luther King Jr. And then, I felt a little guilty because that's a great answer. And then my daughter went, and she trumped us all. She said, I would go back to the theater and prevent Abraham Lincoln from being assassinated. She would save the president, I think is what you said, right? Mm-hmm. And how do you top that? If you don't know yet, Peyton and I were both born on the same day, February 12th, a few years apart. But on February 12th, we shared that birthday with Charles Darwin and with Abraham Lincoln. So Peyton gave more detail than I was expecting. She said I'd save the president, and then we would celebrate with a birthday cake. 3-layer, I guess, one for me, one for Peyton, and one for Honest Abe. So, considering my wife's answer and my answer, I started to kvetch and want to get another answer because my answer looked like toxic masculinity instead of like anything that was well thought out or anything like that. And I said, I can't believe that I answered the OK Corral but I love Doc Holliday. And so then, with the knife firmly placed in my back, Peyton decided to give it a further turn by saying, Dad, you don't even know yourself. If you wanted to have a drink with somebody, it would be C.S. Lewis. And yes, that wouldn't be whiskey. It would be a pint at the Eagle and the Child at the Inklings. And I thought, here's a kid who knows her dad better than he does. That's true. If I could go back in time, I certainly would like to do that. In a moment, we're going to go back in time for a second, and I'm going to give you an origins story about the Sparrow's call. So stay with us, folks. We'll be right back. If I could go back in time, I would probably break my time machine because there's a lot of moments that I have that I could have done better, and I'm sure you feel the same way. One of those moments, though, would be to probably explain why I left my pulpit better to the people at Grace Gospel Fellowship in Bensenville. I know it was a shock to them when we told them we were going to leave and we're moving from Illinois to Arizona. And I know for some people it was rough, and some people are still having a hard time with it. They don't think we should have gone or so forth, or maybe thought we could have handled it better. So I'm going to try today, which is something I'm very uncomfortable in doing, by the way, because I think Sunday services, Church Without Walls, should be dedicated completely and solely to bragging about Jesus Christ and talking about the person of Christ. But, some things get in the way, and the Sparrow's call is a little bit different than Church Without Walls in that the Sparrow's call is meant to reach out to the lost son, or the son in the far country, or the nuns, the duns, and the seekers who don't want to have anything to do with Christianity because of various reasons. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today a little bit, and try again to answer some of the rumors that have been floating around and are kind of annoying. So forgive me today if you tuned in for a normal Sunday session where we normally try and focus on the love of Jesus. But I think this will be helpful for you. I think it'll be helpful for you. By the way, if you wanted to answer your own big question, if you could go back to a place in history and live the moment, what would it be? Please, if you want to share with us, put it in your comments, and I'm sure that all your answers will be better than witnessing the gunfight at the OK Corral. I doubt any of you will top Peyton, though. Saving President Lincoln's pretty good, especially if you share a birthday with him. But just leave that in the comments. Let us know where you're listening from. Why I left my pulpit. So, there's multiple reasons, but I'm going to give you the main reason. There's a couple reasons that I don't feel everyone needs to know that they deserve. They're private, they're family concerns, and some of them had to do with health and so forth, and I just don't think I need to tell everybody everything. I told my best friend, and I told a member of the board, and so they one member of the board at least, and they understood completely. But it wasn't the main reason. The main reason I left is because I couldn't do the ministry, the Sparrow's call, and stay in a pulpit, because the people in the pew would have grown angry at what I'm teaching, and some of them have already, because they think they throw around words like, "Oh, that's slippery slope you're on, Pastor," or "That's heresy," or heretical, and so forth. So I want to kind of talk to these people and talk to others who may not have heard, when I announced that we'd be moving out to Arizona and starting a ministry for people who have doubts about the Christian faith, or who have left it and felt they had no other choice, and so forth. I want to talk to you a little bit about that, and a little bit about my journey over the past 3 years or so, because some people have noticed that I have changed in some of my views, and possibly a great deal in my demeanor. And some people don't quite understand why. Forgive me, folks, for reaching over you. Some people don't understand why. I'm going to try and talk to that a little bit. So why couldn't I do this in church? Because, some of the reasons people are leaving the faith have to do with blind spots in the church's mirror. I mean, we really have some blame to carry in turning people away from the person of Christ and the gospel of Christ. And whether it's something political, whether they see the Christian faith, or at least evangelical Christianity, is tied too closely to a particular party, a political party, or some issues, or whether they see Christianity as anti-science, science denial, or whether they've been harmed by the church, or the hypocrisy of people who carry the Lord's name. There's all kinds of reasons. One of the main reasons is because people who grew up in the church were treated to a house of cards. Their faith they were told it was built on a rock and that it was fortified. And yet they found out when they asked questions and when they searched it out from themselves that their faith didn't always align with common sense or truth that they learned, and that the questions they had about the faith were met with suspicion, and there wasn't a place for them, there wasn't room for them to explore truth or to to pursue truth or to ask hard questions for some simple answers that they were given growing up. And so what they thought was a robust faith turned out to be a house of cards, and whatever win that came along, whether it was growth in an area of science or changing or adopting their own views and not their parents' views about politics or worldview, well, no matter what wind stirred up, it didn't take much to blow the house of cards over, right? And so this happens, and so I decided that I would try and talk to those people and say, you don't have to throw away Jesus Christ just because of the experience you've had growing up in the church and its negative the negative reactions you've developed from it. Because some of those things aren't the gospel. Some of those things are contrary to the gospel. So that's why we're out here in Arizona. We didn't feel, Wendy and I, that we could do this from the pulpit, because if I taught this in a church, by the way, no pastors talk about this stuff in church. Very rarely would you find a pastor who's willing to talk about some of these issues in church. They kind of want to ignore them. The problem is... Oh.
I thought you went here for Carter. Were you just going to leave Carter?
Well, Carter's one of the reasons, that's right, because he's going to college out here. But
okay, good.
Yeah, and we can't leave the fact that Carter's going to college out here. That's one of the reasons. Thank you, Peyton. So where was I? So a few years back, folks, I lived in this old house, let's say. And it was one of these old houses with a winding staircase. And at the top of this house was an attic, and it was an old-fashioned attic that you didn't have to climb through the ceiling. There was actually a door for it. And I opened the door, and I came through into this attic one day, and there was a bare room except for an easel. And on this easel was a painting. And if you've read Oscar Wilde, you know where I'm going with this. And on that painting was a picture of me, and it was hideous. It was ugly, and it was distorted, and it was frightening, and it was deformed. And I looked into this picture, and I asked, how did it get to this, right? How could I be this ugly? And I realized that it wasn't a picture, it was a mirror. And now if you haven't read the picture of Dorian Gray, you kind of understand that I'm projecting myself as the main character here. So I'm trying to be a little bit self-effacing here, because one of the things that happens when you change your mind about something serious is all the people who shared your former opinion now resent the fact that you're saying the opinion I once held was wrong, or maybe even ugly, or bigoted. I go down the line, fill in the blank, or just wrong. And the people that you used to share that in common with, now when you give your testimony and you say, I used to believe this, but I no longer believe this, now they think that you're attacking them personally. And you've made it personal, and you're calling them the picture of Dorian Gray, and you're saying that they're ugly, when actually you're talking about a view that you once held. But they hold it so deeply, they can't separate the fact that they have a view from their own person. And we live in an age like that now. So you can't really disagree with somebody without them taking it personally. We've grown up in an age where emotion trumps intellect and reason, and even faith. And so if they're emotionally attached to something that they believe is the truth, and they believe is their faith, by the way, a lot of things we attach to the faith that aren't part of the faith, then they think you're attacking them when you change your view on that. And this is kind of what took place with me about 3 or 4 years ago. I was jarred to attention because I was firm and rigid in my beliefs, and I had certainty in my beliefs. And I was one of those pastors that was a culture warrior. In other words, I had added that to the gospel. I had Jesus plus something. Now, before we go too far into that, let me give you that confession. 3 or 4 years ago, I stopped watching sports, and we don't need to get into the reasons why, but I was a football addict. I'd watch all 3 games on Sunday. I'd watch Monday night, and Thursday night I taught an evangelism class. But by the time I got home, I could catch the second half of the Thursday night games. And when I was in my car, I was listening to sports radio. I was an addict. I was a football addict, and hours during the football season I spent on football. And so at one point, I kind of was reviewing who I was, and I said, I got to walk away from this. So I did. I walked away from it until last year when a friend of the family started to play quarterback for one of the NFL teams, and then that got us kind of back into watching football, but still not as an addiction. And so I walked away from football, and with all those hours that I had, and I also walked away from political radio, listening to Rush Limbaugh and watching Fox News all the time and all that. I was wasting so much time on this stuff. I said, I'm going to give it a break. I'm going to take a Sabbath, year of Jubilee, and I'm going to do something else. And what I did was invest in reading and in watching lectures and in my education. Most of it centered around the Christian faith, right? And I was so shaken about 3 or 4 years ago by some of my fellow Christians, I said to myself, I'm going to challenge myself, and I'm going to look at all of my positions about the faith, about the worldview I hold, and I'm going to test them. I'm literally going to test them. I'm going to read somebody who critiques my positions, and I'm going to explore other options. And this is called wisdom by the Bible, because the Bible says that one view seems right to a man until it's cross-examined, right? But that the wise man listens to both sides before he takes a decision. Now, Christians will quote that proverb all the time, but we rarely live it out. We normally confirm our bias, and we'll say, well, I'm well read on this subject. I had a friend say to me maybe a year or so ago, we were discussing this idea of young earth creation. He said, I'm really well read on this subject. And I said, well, what have you read that disagrees with your view? And there was an uncomfortable period of silence, because he was well read in his view like I was well read in all of my views. And that is, you find all the people who agree with you, and you buy their books and you read it. And so your understanding of an opposing view is slanted. It's prejudiced by the people who hold your view, because they might represent the views correctly some of the times in their critiques, but the majority of the time there's a distorted straw man that has been created, and you really don't get the view. So what happens? So I start studying things and various topics. I started with Bible, how we got our Bible, and textual criticism, and then science has always been a critical point for me, so I started to study the different views of Genesis and science in the Bible, and how those things either coalesce or they don't. And I spent hundreds of hours doing this, right? And if you follow me on Goodreads, I read about 80 books a year, for 3 or 4 years. And I'd read people who agree with me, people who disagree with me, multiple views on certain subjects. And I really had a wonderful education. And I'll tell you why this is a positive thing in case you want to consider it. And I would hope you would, because there's a few things that'll happen when you challenge your own views. And I think I've grown more by challenging my own views than challenging the views of people I disagree with. But there's 3 positive things that can happen when you challenge your own views and you test them. And one is you can find out you're wrong. And this is where humility comes in. Because if you have humility, and you read an argument that destroys ones you've held previously, then the honest man and somebody who's truly in pursuit of the truth will embrace the truth, no matter how much it hurts, And men I respect the most in the pulpit, I've heard go into the pulpit and say, I once held this view, and so showed me how I was wrong here. Let me show you, and I'd like you to consider it. And my father had done that on occasion, and other men I respect. But there are some men who'll never do this. Their pride is too strong. And even if they learn something and change their mind on something, they don't come into the pulpit and let people know, right? Because they're either too proud or they think it'll harm the institution of the shepherd or whatever, and it actually does more harm not to do that. But humility requires you to follow the truth, right? So the first thing that can happen is you can reject the error you've held and walk more into the light, right? Walk out of Plato's cave. Second thing that can happen is you find yourself that you held the right view, but maybe you couldn't articulate it, or maybe you didn't know all the reasons why. And now, by having studied opposing views and the strengths of the view you held, now you see that you had reason to be, confident in that view. And so it makes you a better teacher, because you've explored what people who don't carry that view think about it. You're better able to answer their objections, right? Because you've actually listened to their objections. You've actually wrestled with them. You actually gave them a shot. You put them on and you walked around the block and you got the blisters and you're saying, well, here's what's attractive about that view, but here's where I see it falling short. And these things happen, right? So the second thing that can happen to you when you examine your own views is you can find out that you held the right view, and your confidence in it gets stronger. And by the way, that can be an act of humility as well. So you can find out you're wrong, you could find out you're right. But the third thing that happens is, as I mentioned, along with the second one, is you grow in wisdom. And that is, you don't, when you've tried on the opposing view, you see that there was some strengths to it. It wasn't just all absurd. And it makes you a better teacher, right? It makes you feel empathy. So you'll feel humility, and you'll feel empathy, and you'll be better able to rhetorically speak to people who are in those shadows still in Plato's cave. You'll be able to say, I once felt this way, but have you considered this? And you become a better teacher because you, like Christ, use the Socratic method. You know that you can't give your knowledge to somebody else, but you can lead them to a question that they can wrestle with and find, right, their own truth, to find the truth that lies there. But it's their own because they've worked for it, right? You're not forcing it on them. You're not teaching them by rote. You're not making them bow down and kiss the Pope's ring or accept a statement of faith or a creed on their own. You actually are well-rounded to be able to talk about it, so you're a better teacher. And you're not just responding emotionally. You can have an intellectual conversation where other people just throw mud or it becomes a heated argument. You can calmly talk about it because you've done your homework and you actually realize that the other side has some credibility. There's some credible reasons for believing the way they do. And it makes you a bridge instead of a wall. Oh, that's a powerful thing. So those are three great reasons to challenge your own views. So in this period of challenging my own views, I found out that as a culture warrior, as a Tea Party pastor, I had become demonic. And I had become an idolater. And that was the picture in my attic that I walked, hey Caspian, that I walked into. I saw myself how other people outside of my tribe were seeing me. And it wasn't beautiful, and it wasn't persuasive, and it had no humility, and it had no empathy, because I hadn't listened to them, and I hadn't walked in their shoes. And so it was an us and them mentality, and the watchman on the wall is going to blow the shofar when he sees evil on the horizon, and this is very different than finding the beaten man on the Jericho road and going to him and nursing his wounds. Now, both of those views are biblical, but one, they're not Christ-like. Both of those views are not Christ-like. And so I had a born-again experience about like 3 or 4 years ago, and don't take it the wrong way. I'm not saying I wasn't a Christ follower before there. I had allowed Christ plus to dominate my thinking and even a lot of what my ministry was. And so for the past 3 years in the pulpit, I centered on the love of Christ, and I tried to undo some of the harm that I had done. And you wouldn't believe it, it ruffled feathers. People didn't want that pastor. They didn't want that John in the pulpit. They wanted the culture warrior. They wanted that old guy that, they could share his Facebook posts that were breathing with fire about the liberals or the Muslims or the LGBTQ community or something like that. They wanted, if I was, in other words, an action figure, they wanted culture warrior pastor, and they didn't want actually the gospel pastor that I became in the last 3 years. And I say this, and I'm not speaking of everybody in my church. Please don't take this as a hit job on them. There were many who walked with me during this time and understood it. And I'll give you an example. On my last Sunday there, the last message I gave there, I walked out and a woman met me in the parking lot, and we're going to call her Sharon to protect her anonymity. And she had been in the church for as long as I was the pastor, even longer. She predated my 20 years. And as I'm walking out, she's crying. Now, there were a lot of tears that Sunday. And so I thought she's crying because her dear friends are moving to Arizona. She's not going to see us. And she wasn't. She was crying, and then she confessed to me something as I'm leaving. I think she felt it was a burden. I don't know how long she carried this burden, but she must have been quite some time. And she wanted to unburden herself before I got out of town. She wanted to share with her shepherd, or former shepherd, her thoughts. And she said to me, tears in her eyes, weeping, she said, I just want to say to you, I don't believe that the gospel is for the few and that the vast majority of people are going to burn in hell for an eternity. And she also said, I don't believe that people who've never heard of the Bible or heard of Jesus Christ are going to be sent to hell by a loving God. And she said 3 or 4 things, and I just remember those top 2 right now. And when she finished, I don't think she knew what I'd say, but I looked at her and I said, neither do I. Because the God you just described is a monster and not worthy of worship. I don't believe in that God either, Sharon. And the surprise in her face and the relief in her face was stunning, right? And then I said something to her, and it wasn't a rebuke. I said, Sharon, for the past 3 years in my evangelism class, CrossFit, we've explored these issues, all 4 issues that you mentioned here. Biblical inerrancy, eternal conscious torment, the gospel, the real gospel, and worldviews and so forth. And I said for 3 years we've been exploring that. And CrossFit was set up so people who had doubts or who had tough questions could actually come there and share their views and talk about them without being judged. Being challenged, yeah, back and forth, but without being judged. You could just let your hair down in CrossFit. And we talked about tough issues and how to grapple with them. And so it was just a wonderful event. But very few people in the church actually came out on Thursday night. Either they lived too far away or they had other, they had other commitments. They couldn't make it. And Sharon was one of those people. She took care of an elderly brother, a sick brother, so she couldn't make it. And I could tell she had wished she was there, because CrossFit really was the bright spot of my whole ministry in the pulpit, I would say. We talked about things that if you talked about on Sunday, 3 or 4 families would leave because they'd be offended, because they were comfortable in certainty and they were very uncomfortable questioning the certainty they had already landed on. And so their faith wasn't robust, but it was rigid. And asking certain questions would make them uncomfortable. And I see this all the time. by the way. So we did things on Thursday we couldn't necessarily do on Sunday, although I tried to bring them in. There's a famous moment in the Civil War where Nathan Bedford Forrest, he was the greatest cavalryman in the Civil War. He was a Southerner, and if you know a little bit about Nathan Bedford Forrest, you might be horrified that I bring him up on a Sunday session, because after the war he went on to start the Ku Klux Klan. Right, but as far as capacity as a cavalry officer, he had never known defeat in battle. His division didn't, his unit didn't, but the South lost battles that he was involved in, and one of them, I believe it was Antietam. And at Antietam, he arrived late, and he was called to protect the retreat of the Confederate Army, and so he was protecting the retreat. And at one point, he called on his unit to charge. You're not supposed to charge when you're in a retreat, right? But Bedford Forrest was a bold captain, and so he charged. And at one point in his charge, he realized that he had yelled "charge," and none of his men responded because they thought it's a suicide mission, right? And it was. And he found himself surrounded by Union soldiers, gun in each hand. It was like something you see at Rooster Cogburn or something. And he realized he was not in a good situation now because his men had not followed him. And so he grabbed a Yankee soldier up onto his horse to protect him as a bullet shield. And so the Union soldiers wouldn't fire on him. And then he rode off, and I think he shot the Union man in the leg, let him live, and threw him off when he was out of range. But I liken that to my last 3 years in the pulpit. I yelled "charge" to my assembly, and only a few people came along that I understood that came along. And a lot of people, their feathers got ruffled by some of the things I was teaching, and they just weren't used to this new message that I was teaching, which was just completely focused on the person of Jesus and love, and how we're to relate to the world. That we are to love God with all we have, and that we are to love our neighbor. See, some people don't want to love their neighbor, or they think that loving their neighbor means smashing their teeth in, like it says in the Psalms. They think defeating them means crushing them either at the ballot box or in some kind of worldview cultural war struggle. And I know, because for a long time I was one of those guys, right? I had led in that way. And one day I woke up to find out that I'm not that pastor. And so I said to myself, well, the church didn't hire this new guy, so maybe it's not right for me to still be in the pulpit here. So that was some of the thinking that went into Wendy and I's discussion about coming out here to Arizona and changing our ministry. And because I wasn't the pastor they hired, obviously a lot of people were uncomfortable with the pastor I had become. And so I thought my integrity required me to gracefully say, thank you. I love all you've done for our family and the opportunity you've given me. I'm seeking out a new opportunity to lead, and I wish you well. And so, where am I now? See, I didn't plan this out. I wasn't going to do this today, and some things came up yesterday, and I said, you know what? I don't want to answer these questions because I'm tired of hearing about these rumors that I don't get to answer. They float around, and I don't get to answer them. So, part of these things that took place, and some of the reasons that people walk away from the faith, have to do with science. And that Christians, especially evangelical Christians, appear to be anti-science. And if you go to Ken Ham's Art Museum, you see displays that show that there were dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden, and they had saddles on. So Adam and Eve actually used domesticated dinosaurs. Of course, this is not in the Bible, and it's bat crap crazy. I'm sorry. And yet it passes as Christianity. And a lot of people see this who have degrees in science or who just work in the medical field, and they say, how can faith coincide? If this truly is the Christian faith, and I see all this truth everywhere else, I don't see how I can hold on to both. And unfortunately, some people look at that and they make the horrible decision that they accept certain things that really aren't the faith as the faith, and they feel that they have to make a decision of either or. And they don't really explore the fact that the vast majority of Christians don't believe that either. You know, that T-Rex bunked with Noah on the ark, even. Some of the really silly stuff, they can't get beyond. And so this is one of those things. And so I began to read on Origins, and I read John Walton, who I highly recommend, and I read Francis Collins, and I read the Harzmas, and I started to read articles over at Biologos, which I highly recommend. And I asked a lot of the hard questions, and Wendy went through all this with me. And I spent hundreds of hours. I read 6 books on the subject. I listened to lectures and debates on the subjects and all these things. And I came to the startling conclusion that all my life I've been wrong on my views here on science and the faith. And it was humbling. And I understood what C.S. Lewis meant when he said, I was the most reluctant convert in all of England, and I was dragged kicking and screaming to the Nazarene on the cross. He was a comfortable atheist, and he didn't want to be shown how wrong he was. And it takes a man to admit that. And fortunately, I don't have a lot going for me, but I've always been passionate about the truth. And my parents instilled that in me. And they said, follow the truth, though the heavens may fall, right? And my mother used to say, be your own man, think for yourself. And that rings in my head. And my father had the humility to change his mind about some deep issues and to say, yeah, I was wrong. And when I taught that or when I believed that. And so I had that in my background. It was very helpful. And so I had this relationship to the truth that actually the truth is more important than our comfort in our certainty or in our tribe or what have you. And so going through this, I read Francis Collins' book, The Language of God. And when I read his book, I started to get very uncomfortable, and I'd tell Wendy, and I'd say, Francis Collins, he's a devout believer, and he was led to the Lord through C.S. Lewis, and he believes in evolution, and he's shocked to find Christians that don't, and he doesn't see any, contradiction between understanding that God is the agent of creation, but yet he used as a mechanism, natural selection and other things in biology and elsewhere, by the way, in astronomy and really in all of the sciences. I mean, to be a Christian in some corners, you have to reject all of modern science, not just biology. It's not just Darwin. It's not just biology. It's astronomy. It's paleontology, it's embryology, it's chemistry, in other words. And so this is why so much is undone when evangelical kids leave their Baptist church and they go to university and they spend one semester in a class, and either it's textual criticism and they find out that verbal plenary inspiration is kind of a circular reasoning fallacy, or they go into a biology 101 class and all they've heard about university and how evil and wicked the professors are doesn't pan out. They find people who are passionate about the truth, who are humble enough to be corrected, who are open to opposing ideas, and everything they've been taught and warned about in their Sunday school or their worldview classes, they find out to be isn't true. And then they're presented with evidence that is in stark contrast to the caricatures of the evidence that they've been given by their tribe. And so now they're out of Plato's cave, and some of them have to make a choice. And it's either the faith or what they see is clearly the evidence. And so they end up leaving the faith instead of realizing, and thank God there are bridges out there like Biologos and other institutions, American Association of Scientists, AAS, and made up of Christians who embrace both the book of Scripture and the book of nature, because God wrote both books. And so they don't try and put one off against the other. and so forth. And so as I'm reading Frances Cowan's book, The Language of God, I'm butt shifting. I'm really uncomfortable. I'm saying, Wendy, the DNA evidence is just overwhelming. And she's praying and she's like, oh no. And so we're reading this and I finished that book and I kind of suspected I was wrong on this subject. And then I read the Harzma's book called Origins, where they lay out all the views that Christians have about origins, about how man came to be and life came to be on planet Earth, and how to reconcile that with the biblical record and so forth, and how to read Genesis and so forth. And if Francis Collins jarred me in the ring, the Origins book knocked me out. I was then convinced that I had been wrong all this time about my understanding of science and the Bible and science and faith. And so that was just one area where what I would say was growth, and others would say is heresy or the slippery slope or whatever. And, in studying these things, I got into a group of scientists, two different groups. One is all Christians, the AAS. I'm a member of the AAS, and they're all Christians who work in universities around the world. They all teach science, and I'm an honorary member. As clergy, they allow a certain amount of clergy in, and I'm in there, and I'm seeing all these scientists talk about the major issues, and they sound very different from what you hear in your local church and in evangelicalism. And you're like shocked to find that there's Christians who believe these things and who can express a confidence both in Scripture and in what modern science has shown us. And, from there, forgive me, there's a number of these other subjects that came up. And I said, Wendy, I think as I'm studying the people who have left the faith, a lot of these subjects overlapped. Kids going to university and leaving the faith needlessly, because you can believe that God is the agent of creation and that his method was evolution. And actually, you can believe even in something as seemingly as absurd as young earth creation and be a good Christian, because that's a second-tier issue and it's not really relevant other than in one area, which I'll share with you right now. And let me do this by just mentioning another science moment where science came in conflict with the church. And it started first with astronomy, right? Galileo, Copernicus before him, and mostly Galileo. You could believe for thousands of years that the earth was the center of the universe, and you'd be fine. It didn't affect you. It didn't affect your message. It didn't affect your life. It didn't affect your evangelism even sharing the gospel with others, until science overwhelmingly showed that that was an error, that the earth isn't the center of the universe. And we not only got the science wrong, what science was telling us about geocentricity, but we also got the scriptures wrong. And Luther was wrong in attacking Copernicus, and Calvin was wrong, and the Pope was wrong. And you find out that both the Catholics and Protestants were wrong, not just on the science, but on their interpretation of the biblical passages as well. And that should keep us humble, right? And but it didn't. And so we're making the same mistakes they are. We're reading modern science into the scripture and then saying, "Thus saith the Lord," when God wrote nature too, and all truth is God's truth. And maybe we're misreading both, the Petri dish and the passage of scripture that we think teaches X, right? And so that's where we need to really be careful. And so I forgot why I brought up the astronomy lesson, but here's why. The moment that science taught the world that it's foolish to believe the earth is the center of the universe, and here's why. Here's all the evidence why. If you clung to that, now what you've done is you've compromised the gospel. Now what you've done is you've asked people to deny the obvious truth that they find in nature to accept your superstition. And so the gospel now became tied to the superstition of either the flat earth, which many people believed, or geocentricity, which many people believed up to a point. So it didn't affect a Christian life or a Christian ministry until science overwhelmingly showed that that view was wrong. And today, the same thing's happening. My mother was a young earth creationist, probably, if you asked her. She didn't really talk about it much. It wasn't critical to her. And she believed in verbal plenary inspiration, that there were no errors or typos or contradictions in the Bible, and no additions or subtractions, and something a very first year student in seminary knows isn't true, because you study textual criticism and you know it's just not true, and we'll talk about that in another session. But anyway, my mom died perfectly comfortable with those views, and she was a wonderful Christian. She was the best Christian I've ever met. And it didn't really matter, because she didn't make those things important. She centered on Christ and the love of God, and those things were never even on the periphery. But here's where it becomes a problem. When it's introduced into evangelism, and when you make it part of your confession of faith. In other words, that you're not a real Christian unless you believe that, the whole world wasn't invented until 6,000 years ago, and that nature's lies, that all those light years, that God's a deceiver, and he put them there, and he buried all those bones in the ground as a test to our faith. And all this ludicrous absurdity that comes out with trying to defend something that we think is in the Bible, that we think is thus saith the Lord, that isn't. And we end up having the egg on our face that Calvin and Luther did when they embraced geocentricity as a fundamental of the faith, and the Pope. So that's where we're at today, that Christians have elevated second-tier and third-tier issues into the gospel and made them all important. And so now we've turned people away from the faith. And so some people on the outside looking in think you have to be a Republican to be a Christian. And you know what? They're not, for any one of a number of reasons. Or maybe they're just apolitical and they see something is wrong there. And, this is going to take me more than 1 week to do, but let me close with this. As I was reading all these things on my views and testing them, and some of my views got stronger, and some of my views just were blown away immediately, because they were weak, and they were built on sand out of cards, and not built on the stone of Christ out of rocks. And I admit that to you in a humble way, saying I've been wrong about a lot, right? And if you think about it, if you're not omniscient, which you aren't, there are things you hold to be gospel truth that aren't right now. And when I said that I held demonic views, here's what I meant. And it's from C.S. Lewis and the Screw Tape Letters. Now, if you don't know what the Screw Tape Letters, here's my real short summary. C.S. Lewis wrote during World War II a supposal. And he said, what if an Oxford Don found these ancient letters, but they weren't ancient. He found these letters, they were contemporary, and they were written not by a human, but by one demon to another, advising the junior demon how to work on his patient, on the person he's trying to influence for Satan, and away from what the letters call the enemy, or God. And so he wrote these series of letters that try and lay out systematic theology in regard to demonology, and there's so much great biblical wisdom in there. Now, a war was going on, and it was a war between good and evil, literally good and evil, right? I mean, the British against the Germans, the Nazis, the free world against totalitarianism. And so he wrote these letters, and in a couple of them he talked about politics and patriotism and pacifism. And here we can see something that he's getting at. I want to show you just for a second. Let's just look at what he says quickly, if you don't mind. I'm gonna read for you now. He says about the general connection between Christianity and politics. Our position is more delicate. Now, remember, this is a demon talking to a junior demon, right, and telling him how to how to work Satan's magic in this new believer's life. He says, certainly we do not want men to allow their Christianity to flow over into their political life, for the establishment of anything like a really just society would be a major disaster. On the other hand, we do want, and want very much, to make men treat Christianity as a means. Preferably, of course, as a means to their own advancement, but failing that, as a means to anything. So not just the prosperity gospel, but even to social justice, even to their political ends. The thing to do is to get a man at first to value social justice as a thing which the enemy demands, and then work him onto the stage at which he values Christianity because it may produce social justice. Now, you can substitute anything for social justice here. You could substitute small government, or lower taxes, or the pro-life movement, or any other political element you could put in there for social justice, and it works, right? The thing to do is to get a man at first to value small government, or the right to keep and bear arms, or substitute anything in there as a thing which the enemy demands, and then work him on to the stage at which he values Christianity because it may produce social justice. For the enemy will not be used as a convenience. God will not be used as a political slogan. But men or nations want to use them for that. Men or nations who think they can revive the faith in order to make a good society might just as well think they can use the stairs of heaven as a shortcut to the nearest chemist shop. Fortunately, it is quite easy to coax humans around this little corner. Only today I've found a passage in a Christian writer where he recommends his own version of Christianity on the ground that only such a faith can outlast the death of old cultures and the birth of new civilizations. You see the little rift? Believe this not because it is true, but for some other reason. That's the game. And the other reason could be pragmatism. The other reason could be to destroy the liberals or the conservatives or whatever position you're in. All right, one more letter. Let me just share one more letter to you here. He said, I had not forgotten my promise to consider whether we should make the patient an extreme patriot or an extreme pacifist. You see, here's two opposing views, right? Patriot or pacifist. It's World War II, and he's a British Christian, not drafted, not in the war yet. And he said, now the demon goes on here and says, all extremes except extreme devotion to the enemy are to be encouraged. Not always, of course, but at this period, some ages are lukewarm and complacent, and then it is our business to soothe them yet faster asleep. Other ages, of which the present is one, are unbalanced and prone to faction, and it is our business to inflame them. I have to say, folks, our age is the present one, unbalanced and prone to faction. And you see it in how the Americans react to each other over President Trump or over the coronavirus or other things. And it is our business to inflame them. If your patient can be induced to become a conscientious objector, pacifist, he will automatically find himself one of a small, vocal, organized, unpopular society, and the effects of this on one so new to Christianity will almost certainly be good. But only almost certainly. Has he had serious doubts about the lawfulness of serving in a just war before this present war began? Is he a man of great physical courage? So great that he will have no half-conscious misgivings about the real motives of his pacifism? Can he, when nearest to honesty, no human is ever very near, feel fully convinced that he's actuated wholly by the desire to obey the enemy? If he is that sort of man, his pacifism will probably not do us much good, and the enemy will probably protect him from the usual consequences of belonging to a sect. Your best plan in that case would be to attempt a sudden, confused, emotional crisis from which he might emerge as an uneasy convert to patriotism. Such things can often be managed, but if he's the man I take him to be, try pacifism. And he closes with this, and I want you to listen and let this marinate, folks. Whichever he adopts, your main task will be the same. Let him begin by treating the patriotism or the pacifism as a part of his religion.
then let him, under the influence of partisan spirit, come to regard it as the most important part. Then quietly and gradually nurse him onto the stage at which the religion becomes merely part of the cause, in which Christianity is valued chiefly because of the excellent arguments it can produce in favor of the British war effort, of the pro-life movement, of smaller government, of the right to keep and bear arms, or of pacifism, or of social justice. The attitude which you want to guard against is that in which temporal affairs are treated primarily as material for obedience. Once you've made the world an end, remember, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world, or my servants would fight." What fight are you in this morning? Once you have made the world an end and faith a means, you've almost won your man, and it makes very little difference what kind of a worldly end he's pursuing, provided that meetings, pamphlets, policies, movements, causes, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, MSNBC, and crusades matter more to him than prayers and sacraments and charity. And he's ours. And the more religious on those terms, the more securely ours. And I could show you a pretty cage full down here. You see, what Satan does is what C.S. Lewis mentioned elsewhere. He, the devil, always sends errors into the world in pairs of opposites, pacifist or patriot. He relies on your extra dislike of one to draw you gradually into the opposite one. But do not let us be fooled. We have to keep our eyes on the goal, Christ and him crucified, and go straight through between both errors. We have no other concern than that with either of them. And so this is where I found myself. I found myself guilty of having been influenced by wormwood, or at least screw tape. And I had become a culture warrior pastor and a Tea Party pastor, and it was a part of the faith. It was the warp and woof of Christianity, and this is why Christianity was here. And I found myself naked, listening to Jesus talk to Pilate and saying, "If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would fight." And I thought to myself, I'm fighting for a kingdom of this world, so whose servant am I? And I've led a flock of sheep along with me. And what now? Well, I spent 3 years trying to change, but my flock didn't want to follow me for the most part. Some of them have. Some of them still listen. But for the most part, I got a lot of friction, and my family took a lot of grief. And I realized this is not fair, because they didn't hire. They wanted the other guy. They want the watchman on the wall who's going to punch evil in the nose, instead of the guy who's going to get down on his knees with a basin of water and a towel and love with the love of God, my enemy, my neighbor. So here we are, folks, and over the next few weeks, you're going to see me interview people who've been on this journey, who've walked it before me, who've walked it next to me, and if you have a son or a daughter or a husband who's strayed from the faith, or who's having doubt, and who's doesn't find room in the church for his doubts or his questions, send him to the Sparrow's Call. We truly welcome all those who come in peace. Atheist, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim. If you want to explore truth with us, we welcome you. Now, I have to tell you, I am a follower of Jesus Christ. Contrary to popular belief, people don't think I'm a Christian because I don't think just like them, and so they might have slandered me. You might have heard some of the slander. You might have shared some of the slander. I am a devout follower of Jesus Christ, and yet there's room at my table for you, even if you're not, right? And I welcome you here. So in the few coming weeks, we'll talk about how the demon Screwtape and Wormtongue have had their way with the Christian church, and I will just say to you, I'll leave you with this, and then we'll see what Peyton drew. Daryl Davis was one of my inspirations for spiritual growth. He's the black rock and roll musician, pianist, jazz blues guy, played with Chuck Berry and all the greats. And I call him black, not because I see him as a black man, but because the world does. And one of his crazy hobbies is he goes to Klan meetings, and he talks to Klan members. And over the years, he's loved them, and he's listened to them, and he's treated them like human beings, and he's persuaded over 200 hate-filled skinheads, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and Klan members to take off their robe and take the hand of a black man and call him brother. And he did it the way Christ would do it on the Jericho Road. He didn't do it by calling them ugly or by declaring how wrong they are. He treated them with love and dignity, and he listened to them, and then he made his appeal. And they saw him as a human being and as someone who actually cared and who actually listened, and they responded to love. They responded to love. And this is my motivation, and this is kind of the foundation of the Sparrow's call from Wendy and I's point. We don't want to win debates. We want to win a hearing with people who think different from us, and we want to show them the beautiful source of that light that is Jesus Christ and his love that he has for them. If you want to come along on this mission with us, we welcome you. We do. And over the next few weeks, we'll be talking about that. But let me just say this to you. When Daryl Davis leaves a man out of the Klan, right, we celebrate it, right, because we're not bigots, because we're not on the other side of the equation. And we think it's great and a story of victory, and we want to hear about it, and we want to put it in magazines, and we want to make documentaries about it, and we want to celebrate it. And yet I want to show you another side for a second. That man who's left the Klan, he's got a family, and he's got a group of friends that he's been with for decades, in some cases. And when he gives his testimony now, and he says that his past life was filled with hate and disgust and despair and misery, and he's sorry for what he caused, the unnecessary harm and the naivete and the ignorance and the ugliness of the whole thing, what his friends and family are hearing is that they are ugly and that they're hideous and that he hates them. And he doesn't hate them. He hates what he was. And he feels that, he feels passion to them. And yet they can't hear it. All they hear is that he hates them. And so that's happened with Wendy and I. We've had family and friends not understand what we're doing. And they think we've left the reservation, and we're looking back and saying it's ugly. And we have left the plantation, and we're looking back and saying slavery is ugly. And we're taking a Harriet Tubman appeal to try to say, wait a minute, if you have any respect for us at all and any love for us at all, at least listen to why we've changed some of our views and why some of our views that we held with you are stronger. And it takes a person of humility and true love to actually stop and listen for a second. Right? You don't have to agree with us, but at least if you respect us at all, stop and listen. And maybe you'll find some truth there, and maybe you'll just find some understanding in your disagreeing with us. But we are your brother and sister in Christ, and all we're asking for is that you have empathy for people who are outside the body of Christ, who don't see things the way you do, and you look at them not as an enemy, but as a victim, as somebody who's been beaten on the side of the road, and God has called us to go minister to them when the priest and the Levite walk right by him and judge him. God has called us to go into the far country after our little brother, not to stay in the field cursing father and brother, or stand on the corner with the Pharisees pointing our finger, yelling about the darkness of sin. We know sin's dark. We've been sent into the darkness as a light to bring our brothers home. Let's do this together. All right, Pay. Let's see. Look at that. You look bored. I put you to sleep. What do you got for us today, Pay?
I got a picture.
Well,
I got a picture with two horses, one here, one here. And this one's saying, the V-shaped part on the underside of a horse's hoof is called the frog.
ooh.
And then this baby horse is saying, hi, you, and yay. And she's saying, hi.
So the V-shaped part under the horse's hoof is called the frog. See, we learn something all the time when you do this. What else you got there?
And a male donkey is called a jack. And when
A jackass? You could say it.
Dad, no, it just said Jack
Well,
in the book.
okay. It must be a Christian book.
Born, Zebra's stripes are brown, not black.
So when a zebra's born, his stripes are brown, and then they turn to black. But do you have a zebra on there anywhere? Is he coming next
No.
week? All right, well, thank you for sharing that, Peyton. You have any final words for our friends?
Bye.
Bye. We love you, folks. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.